The third-floor corridor was plunged into a heavy gloom, broken only by the intermittent hum of fluorescent lights. The patient, a middle-aged man with a lost look and skin as cold as marble, clutched the sheet to his chest as he begged, his voice cracking to be transferred. "There's someone there, watching me." The nurses exchanged glances, accustomed to outbursts and delirium, but there was something about his posture, the involuntary tremor in his hands, the cold sweat pouring down despite the frigid air, that made the request sound more like a desperate confession than a whim. Room 314, the one he wanted to leave, was in the least trafficked wing of the hospital, isolated by narrow corridors and stained walls. There, the silence wasn't empty, but dense, as if carrying a weight. When the door opened, a cold breeze escaped, sending goosebumps across everyone's skin. The patient didn't look back. He walked down the hall with his head down, as if turning his head would confirm that the thing, whatever it was still there, waiting. Hours later, Amanda, the nurse on duty, had to enter 314 to organize the bed for the next patient. When she turned on the light, she noticed it flicker 3 times before stabilizing. A strange pattern, but easy to ignore, until she felt, with the precision of a physical touch, a heavy gaze on the back of her neck. She turned quickly, finding only the bare wall. However, the reflection in the window showed something that wasn't there. A dark, motionless silhouette, exactly where the patient had sat hours before. Amanda's heart raced, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. The figure in the reflection didn't move, until slowly it tilted its head to the side, as if curious. At that moment, the light flickered again, and when the light returned, the reflection was no longer just a shadow. Pale eyes shone from within, fixed on her. Amanda took a step back, but realized that, in the glass, the figure was now closer, just a step away from passing through. The case of room 314 at St. Helena Medical Center in rural Massachusetts remains one of the strangest and most disturbing stories ever recorded in a hospital setting in the United States. The building, opened in 1928, had already undergone structural renovations, equipment replacement, and modernization of entire wings, but some areas seemed to retain an atmosphere that time could not dispel. The third floor, in particular, maintained a silence that did not convey peace, but rather a constant sense of waiting. The walls, marked by old leaks, exuded a faint smell of mildew mixed with disinfectant, and the fluorescent bulbs hung from rusted brackets, oscillating between cold white and a sickly yellow. This was where room 314 was located, at the end of a narrow corridor where few people liked to pass after nightfall. The patient who would become central to this case, identified in the records only as Michael R., had been hospitalized for heart complications. In the first few days, he was cooperative and polite, interacting with the staff and even commenting on the tranquility of the hospital. However, in the early hours of the 4th day, everything changed. According to Amanda Collins, a nurse with over 15 years of experience, Michael began showing clear signs of anxiety, requesting that the door to his room be kept open and that the light never be turned off. The following night, his tension reached its limit. Pale, trembling, and breathing. Irregularly, he called Amanda and begged to be transferred to another room. He said he couldn't sleep because someone was watching him from the darkness, and that this presence wasn't in the room, but all around him. Amanda tried to calm him, explaining that no one was there and that cameras monitored the entire floor. But Michael insisted, repeating that it wasn't visible on the cameras and that he didn't need light to see. His eyes wandered to the darkest corner of the room, always the same, where the curtain met the wall, as if something were there, still, motionless, patient. As he was transferred, Michael walked down the hallway without looking back, which caught everyone's attention. He seemed convinced that if he turned around, he would confirm that the thing was still there, waiting. Room 314 had a temperature that didn't obey the thermostat, a chill that seemed to rise from the polished floor and cling to his bones like ancient damp. And Michael R. noticed it the first night he tried to sleep there, turning on his side, searching in the artificial softness of his pillow for some shelter that didn't come. Because the air wasn't just cold, it seemed to vibrate as if carrying a hidden, almost inaudible hum that pressed against his eardrums and insisted on reminding him that there was something silent watching. And he began counting breaths to trick his mind, inhaling slowly, exhaling in 4 beats, keeping his eyes closed while the light from the hallway filtered in through a crack in the door and drew a pale line on the floor, a ruler of brightness that for some reason shrank. When he squinted, and when he decided to look, he saw that the line wasn't getting any smaller. It was the shadow of something standing between the door and the bed, motionless, in the exact position where a visitor would wait to be noticed. And Michael tried to call out. The nurse pressed the button, but the click of the remote didn't bring the familiar sound, just a dry snap. And the shadow didn't react, just existed unhurriedly, as if it had all the time in the world to be perceived. And it was then that he closed his eyes tightly, because he'd learned that sometimes fear loses its power in voluntary darkness. However, with his eyes closed, it was worse. The presence took shape inside his head, thickening in the place where memory files silhouettes. And there it began to breathe, slowly, a breath that didn't displace the air, but seemed to suck the courage from his own chest. When dawn came, logic returned like a thin blanket, insufficient but familiar, and Michael ordered coffee, talked little, told shy jokes to the physical therapist. However, as afternoon fell, the hallway light once again drew a ruler on the floor, and the cold crept back through the seams of the sheet. And this time, the shadow didn't come from the door. It came from the corner where the curtain met the wall, a long fold that didn't match the fabric, a density beyond the fabric. And Michael used his cell phone to turn on the flashlight, pointing it at the corner, watching the light hit, but not immediately penetrate, as if there were volume in the darkness, as if the darkness had learned to have thickness. And it was at that moment that he decided he wouldn't sleep there anymore, that he would ask for a transfer, that he would endure the shame of appearing weak, because worse than appearing weak was continuing to be watched by something that made no noise, but insisted on existing precisely at the limit where the cameras couldn't capture it, in the microscopic interval between light and the lack of it. And when Nurse Amanda came in and saw his condition, his pale lips, his shrunken body, his trembling hands gripping the edge of the mattress, she understood that it wasn't an act, that there was an unstaged fear there, a fear that did not ask for applause, only escape. After Michael was moved to a room closer to the infirmary, 314 sat empty for a few hours, and absence that should have restored the space's neutrality. But when Amanda went in to gather her belongings, she noticed a kind of visual echo. The sheets seemed wrinkled in places no one had touched. The bars had handprints at the wrong height, as if larger fingers had rested there with the weight of someone who didn't need muscles. And the overhead light, when turned on, performed a ritual she hadn't registered before. 3 blinks, a pause, another long blink, stability, as if someone were snapping their fingers to organize the electricity. Amanda smiled nervously, made the usual inside joke about old buildings and stubborn fixtures. But the smile faded when, arranging the side table, she noticed the presence of a silhouette behind her in the window pane. The reflection showed her accompanied, although the room was empty, and what paralyzed her was not the human shape of the shadow, but the way the reflected head tilted a second after the real tilt of her own head, as if the image were delayed, trying to learn the gesture, correcting the choreography with a minimal but real delay. And that was impossible. It was talking to some primitive region of the brain that recognizes predators by rhythm. And Amanda turned her body to confirm the emptiness, finding only the corner where the curtain meets the wall. And then she looked back at the glass and saw that the silhouette now was not exactly where it should be. It was half a step closer to the bed, an advance without displacement, a stealing of distance, and the lamp blinked again, by whim or in response. When she left 314, Amanda took with her the kind of doubt that doesn't fit in the medical record, a doubt that finds its way into the details. The clock in the hallway read 3:14 when she finally signed the form, and the coincidence irritated her because of the obvious theatricality of the number, as if the hospital were a concert hall. But the irritation gave way to a stubborn thought. What if coincidence were precisely the language of certain things? And without telling anyone, she decided to go back there before the end of her shift, just to turn the light off and back on, to prove to herself that the delayed reflex was imagination, that the tired body easily invents monsters when the hours become elastic. However, when she returned, she found the lamp off, although the switch was in the on position, and she had to turn it twice for the light to obey, repeating the blinking ritual, 3 quick ones, 1 long one. Stability. And in the glass, the silhouette did not appear immediately, which would be a relief if it were not for the detail. Her own reflection, for an impossible instant, smiled without her having smiled. A micro-gesture that could be optical noise, tiredness, suggestion, anything but normal. But before continuing the story, check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because there is a new video here every day. St. Helena's policy required recording any electrical anomaly, and although Amanda didn't want to appear impressionable, the blinking ritual and the delayed reflex were enough to alert maintenance and, by extension, security. So Ortiz, the night guard, went up with her to the 3rd floor with a humor somewhere between skepticism and camaraderie, saying he'd seen a rat turn off a light bulb with its teeth and that nothing beats the boredom of inventing ghosts. But at the door to 314, he fell silent himself, as if the ward's breathing had changed. There, and pulled out the unnecessary set of keys for an unlocked door, an automatic gesture meant to postpone the inevitable. When they entered, Amanda described the behavior of the light, which, true to form, blinked as expected, and Ortiz made the protocol note, the kind of line that disappears in spreadsheets. But when she pointed to the glass and explained the delayed reflex, the guard smiled didactically and said that reflex is physics, that sometimes the brain processes it differently. Difference. And it was at that moment that they both looked at the window at the same time. Amanda raised her right hand slowly, like a teacher demonstrating a principle, and the reflection raised its hand a beat later. Not enough to look like a trick, enough to solidify the fear, and Ortiz, his skepticism wounded, put his nose close to the glass to make sure there was no film, no overlap, nothing, and came back with a restrained curse, because the room behind them was still empty. But in the glass, the vague impression of a second figure appeared, an outline behind Amanda, too tall to be her, narrow in the shoulders, with his head tilted as if examining, and Amanda, who didn't want to tremble, trembled. They decided to check the cameras, an obvious and futile measure, and went down to the monitoring room, where split screens displayed weary hallways and immobile elevators. They asked to rewind the 3rd floor circuit between 310 and 320, the window covering the trip to and from 314. The video showed an empty corridor in every passage, as if the building were a diagram, perfect lines devoid of presence. Amanda, impatient, asked for the angle of 314 that included the glass, and there too normality prevailed. Nothing but surfaces, fixed light, correct absence. Ortiz scratched his beard, less confident, and mentioned lag in the transmission, but Amanda knew the difference between video delay and gesture delay. One comes with blurs and breaks, the other comes with intention. And what she had seen had intention, and intention doesn't record on the circuit. It records on the skin. From that night on, curiosity overcame common sense, and she began a diary of discrete obsessions. How many blinks the lamp made before stability, how many milliseconds separated her gesture from the reflected gesture, how many times the number 314 appeared on the ward clocks when no one asked for it. And this intimate accounting, done in pen on the back of cold cards, inaugurated a war of patience with that which inhabits the intervals. Hospitals are forgetting machines, spaces that work to transform brutal events into manageable routines. But there are always rooms that resist the digestion of time. And 314 had a discrete list of peculiarities written down on immigration cards, messages that went from pockets to clipboards and never became official documents, complaints of cold with the air conditioning off, nausea without cause, insomnia resistant to sedatives, a feeling of constant wakefulness even with eyes closed, and a cleaning assistant, Donna Iris, swore that there were nights when the bathroom mirror sweated letters when no one had showered, crooked letters that resembled initials or numbers, but since no one saw them at the time, the story went into the drawer of internal folklore, the B-side of any team. There was also the case of Richard Palmer, the oldest patient who had died weeks before Michael, a lucid elderly man who, in his last days, had refused sleep and demanded absurd somersaults on pillows to keep his face away from the angle of the glass, because he said that glass learns, a phrase that became the favorite joke of anyone who needed to laugh at something, until Amanda found, at the bottom of a drawer in 314, a paper folded with childish firmness, written in shaky handwriting, "When the reflection knows everything, it leaves." Amanda took the note home without telling anyone, hiding her own gesture from her rational side, and began discreetly researching incidents in hospitals in the American Northeast, finding scattered mentions of cold rooms, windows that delayed gestures, and short stories in local newspapers from the 1940s about a ward closed indefinitely due to security anomalies, words that say nothing and yet say everything when read with the right predisposition. And one Sunday night, she decided to return to 314 off-duty, convincing the guard that she had forgotten a ring. She entered with her cell phone on airplane mode so that nothing would interfere with the experience other than her own will. She turned on the light, counted the blinks, approached the window, raised her hand, saw the delay, timed by an app in an attempt to transform horror into a number, and realized that the delay had decreased since the last time. If before it was a full heartbeat, now it was half a heartbeat, a synchronicity trying to emerge. And when whispered, "What do you want?" didn't wait for a supernatural answer. But the answer came in the only language that thing seemed to master. A breath of cold stuck to the side of her face, not moving her hair, but freezing her skin, as if the air had turned to metal, and, in the glass, the silhouette inclined its head in the same way she had inclined, but without any delay, and Amanda, for an absolute second, was certain that that surface had ceased to be a surface. Once curiosity overcame her initial fear, Amanda transformed 314 into a clandestine laboratory. She returned with a cheap digital recorder, the kind reporters use for interviews, and set it up on the nightstand while quietly asking whatever was there to repeat the beats, pretending to believe in the oldest logic of communication, rhythm by rhythm, and she tapped the bed rail 3 times lightly. In the silence that followed, the recorder picked up no sound, but her body picked up the feedback in the form of a change in the density of the air, a cold pulse that arrived at regular intervals, as if someone on the other side were rapping their knuckles against something too soft to reverberate. And then Amanda decided to use what seemed to be the preferred language of presence, reflection, approaching the glass with the reverence one offers to high voltage, raising her hand with deliberate slowness, observing the micro-delay that remained and which now amounted to the time of a quick blink. And when she opened her fingers, she saw that the reflection had opened too, and astonishment arose when the reflected image revealed a detail that was not on her real hand, a small scar at the base of her thumb that she did not have, a mark invented by the glass, as if the reflection were a superimposed version of someone who knew the gesture but did not know the body and was therefore improvising. Over the next few days, the tests continued, and the delay diminished to the point of disappearing in isolated moments, a perfect synchrony that came in flashes, never sustained for long. In those moments, Amanda felt the room shift in scale, as if the walls advanced a centimeter and the ceiling lowered another, and the vertigo accompanied it. She tried to record a video of the phenomenon, but the final file showed only her, alone, repeating gestures in front of the glass, with no extra shadow, no obvious delay, which left her somewhere between relief and anger, because what mattered seemed to choose not to be documented, and that made sense. Some things are meant to be witnessed, not archived, and witnesses are fragile. The breaking point came when, after 20 minutes of studied silence, Amanda's reflection in the glass inclined its head before her, as if learning had passed through the mirror and now brought the gesture forward. And in that instant the overhead light didn't blink. It went out completely, plunging the room into a darkness so dense that the noise of the hospital vanished. There were no monitors, no distant carts, and in the background a sound of breathing appeared, not human but rhythmic, and Amanda, not one to pray, whispered an old prayer from childhood, and the light returned with a snap, and on the glass were fingerprints, 5, long, as if someone had pushed from the inside. Have you ever witnessed a supernatural event? Tell us your story in the comments. Nothing that happens in an isolated room stays isolated for long, and news of the oddities of 314 began to trickle into the hospital's daily life in the form of jokes in the cafeteria, veiled requests for bed changes, comments about intelligent air currents. But it was only when the phenomenon left the room that the staff understood that the thing had learned not just gestures, it had learned paths. One night, Amanda, already on another floor, washed her hands at the nurse's station and, looking at the black screen of a switched-off monitor, saw behind her the same head tilt that followed her in the glass of room 314, an echo that respected no geography. She didn't tell anyone, keeping to herself the impossible hypothesis that the reflection followed her. And suddenly, some patients near room 314 began reporting dreams of people in the glass. An 8-year-old child drew a window with eyes on a sheet of paper and gave the drawing to his mother with the phrase, "The eyes live in the glass." And the head of nursing, pressured by rumors and an imperceptible but real drop in the patient's rest indicators, ordered room 314 closed for electrical maintenance, an official and convenient justification, while Amanda did the only thing she could still do. Right. She recorded every detail of each night, the number of blinks, the time, the approximate temperature. The phrase, "when the reflection knows everything, it leaves," repeated at the bottom of each page, like a mantra that simultaneously invoked and exorcised, and it was in this effort that she noticed a pattern. The peaks of activity coincided not with absolute silence, but with moments when the hospital was nearly silent, when there was enough noise to deceive the vigilance of consciousness, and she understood that perhaps the phenomenon thrived in the in-between space, neither full light nor total darkness, neither silence nor noise, and this understanding made her more vulnerable, because the in-between space exists everywhere, including in the face of the sleeper. The final confirmation of the contagion came one early morning of slanting rain when Amanda turned off the faucet in the health center bathroom and saw the fogged-up mirror draw a sentence that wasn't a sentence, a line of drops forming letters that ran too fast to read but slow enough to suggest a signature. For a moment, she had the impression that her own reflection, behind the steam, was turning its face to observe not herself, but whoever was outside. She remembered Michael R., his raw fear, his refusal to look back, and felt the entire hospital watching her with the same icy patience as in room 314. It was at that point that she decided she wasn't dealing with a haunted room, but with a method of approximation. The reflection was a muscle, and whatever was breathing behind it was growing stronger. Despite the official decision to close 314 for electrical maintenance, Amanda knew the doors were no barrier to what moved between reflective surfaces. The room remained sealed, but the stories spread throughout the hospital. Technicians reported tools disappearing and reappearing in inverted positions. Cleaning women claimed to see figures passing through the hallways, reflected in the bucket of water, and a doctor even confessed to avoiding looking at the glass panels in the operating room. Amanda, increasingly obsessed, began to roam the hospital as if mapping an invisible territory, testing reflections in polished doorknobs, elevator doors, and even syringes, where she sometimes noticed a movement that didn't correspond to her own. The physical closure of 314 seemed to have provoked a dispersion reaction, as if the presence was seeking new points to manifest itself, expanding its field of action. With each day, the certainty grew. This was not a haunted place, but a parasitic life form of the reflection, learning and expanding. The reflection now appeared not only at work, but also in Amanda's home life. The bathroom mirror at dawn showed her eyes open while she was still blinking. The black television screen reflected her room, slightly distorted, but always with an extra shadow in the corner. One night, the reflection in her bedroom window began to perfectly mimic her breathing, until it stopped abruptly as she continued to gasp. Amanda realized with horror that she was being watched not only in the hospital, but on any surface that could reflect her image. Her dreams became more vivid, endless glass corridors, hands appearing on the other side, and a face that changed as she tried to focus. She would wake with the sensation that something had crept too close during her sleep, leaving a cold residue on her pillow. A few weeks after the closure of 314, a newly admitted patient began experiencing symptoms identical to Michael's: insomnia, chills, and the persistent feeling of being watched. When questioned, he described a silhouette that moved with an imperceptible delay in the reflections of windows and metal instruments. Amanda saw this as confirmation that the phenomenon was now itinerant. When visiting this patient's room, she noticed the same head tilt on the monitors off-screen, only more confident, faster. The reflection was no longer learning, it already knew. The next day, the patient was found in a catatonic state, staring at the bathroom mirror with his lips forming inaudible words. The glass was fogged, but clear to the exact outline of a hand spread on the other side. After Daniel, the hospital began to spin with a strange gravity. Any conversation about the subject ended in reverberating silence. Amanda realized the only way out was to cross. She waited for a dawn of slanting rain, stole an old shutter hook from maintenance, climbed the stairs to avoid cameras, and parked in front of the yellow tape. The padlock was new, polished, a perfect reflection. To look at it was to accept the game. She glanced at the metal out of the corner of her eye, counted her breaths, inserted the hook into the crack in the door, and gave in to the small sound of the worn metal. 314 smelled like a mixture of disinfectant and wet dust, the kind of smell that tells you no one has been there, and yet someone is already there. The light performed its ritual. 3 blinks, a pause, a long one, stability. And when it stabilized, it revealed an off-kilter geometry. It seemed to Amanda that the room was a centimeter narrower. The window reflected not just her body, but layers of others. They weren't white ghosts. They were opaque overlays, occupations. A crowd, compact, with heads tilted at the same patient angle. No sudden movements, no cheap scares, just the patience of those who know the outcome and await the agreement of the living body. Amanda approached so close that she felt the cold radiate from the window pane like a poorly closed freezer. For the first time, the image didn't imitate her. The Amanda in the glass raised her hand before her and kept her palm outstretched, as if demonstrating the absence of weapons. There was an unnatural elongation in the reflected fingers, more phalanx than finger, as if the glass had learned the idea of a hand, but not proportion. The ceiling cracked, not by the building's doing, but as if a tongue clicked for silence. The light bulb, instead of blinking, exploded with a sharp crack, and a cloud of luminous dust precipitated. The resulting darkness wasn't the absence of light. It was the presence of darkness. Amanda took a shallow breath and heard her breath return with a slight difference, not an echo, but a delay, the old idiom. She spoke softly, as if her voice could break the membrane. "I know you learn." The glass responded with a cold breath that didn't dislodge her hair, but bit the skin of her cheek. The reflected hand moved closer, with funereal slowness, until the distance between skin and glass ceased to exist as a useful measure. At the exact moment Amanda decided to retreat, a pressure appeared on her shoulder, a hand pressure that existed only in the body's interpretation, and her left leg weakened. The floor, for a second, tilted like a deck. The entire hospital seemed to tilt with it. Outside, footsteps. She retreated into the darkness, guided by the memory of the plant, felt for the doorknob, locked it from the inside, laughed. A mistake. From the glass, something laughed later, a humorless grain, a lesson. Amanda's experience took shape as other accounts, once considered legend, began to arrive with dates, names, blurry photographs and shift stamps. A Chicago nurse described a mirror that breathed in pediatrics. The glass fogged and cleared at a rate contrary to that of children. A maintenance technician in Queens swore he saw his reflection raise his hand before he decided to move a wire. He thought it was a lighting trick, until he realized the image bore a small scar on a finger he didn't have. In Pittsburgh, a retired surgeon recounted the day all the mirrors in the locker room blew out at 3:14 a.m. without a single fuse blowing. That same week, a patient quit himself and never returned. Digitized archives of old newspapers carried echoes. An unsigned note from 1947 mentioned anomalies in North Wards after window coverings were replaced. Professionals avoid reporting for fear of ridicule. An internal bulletin from 1963, postmarked by a state hospital, used engineering jargon to describe non-engineering. Lighting out of sync around 3:14 a.m. Investigation indicates no electrical cause. Power line noise hypothesis rejected. A 1988 file recorded anonymous notes. Don't cut your nails in front of the new windows. Cover panels when turning off the lights. The pattern repeated itself with the elegance of learned horrors: delay, equality, advancement. Amanda made a map with pins on a corkboard at home. Boston, Providence, Albany, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Beside it, small notes with 3 blinks, metallic smell, hand flattened from inside. Strings linked nocturnal dates, almost always in waves coinciding with infrastructure upgrades. Smoother. Windows, more polished steel, sharper screens. A physicist friend of a friend, consulted unofficially, proposed theories about high reflectance surfaces as amplifiers of perceptual feedback patterns. Amanda let her friend speak and thanked her. It would be nice if someone gave academic-sounding names to what in the end boiled down to the body's first impulse when it sees a head tilt before its own. Retreat. Among the many anonymous emails, one came with a bad image from an old camera. Empty room, a window in the background, and a clear, inverted hand spread out outside. The sender simply wrote, "Don't ask questions, cover the glass." Another enclosed a list of precautions. Never stop in front of two opposing surfaces. Never accept the first gesture of the reflection as confirmation. If the light flashes 3 times, don't fill the silence with your name. Amanda printed it, folded it, and put it in her lab coat pocket. The hospital didn't close. Life didn't suspend normalcy. To accommodate fear, St. Helena continued to admit, treat, and discharge patients. 314, sealed, became an administrative problem to be solved when funding arose. The displaced presence learned shortcuts and began visiting whatever was smooth enough. Amanda reorganized the world, like someone changing languages. She removed the mirrors from her home, covered screens, ran her hand over surfaces before looking at them, adopted a wardrobe without shiny buttons. Soon, she no longer knew if the relief came from opacity or from the habit of fright. Her body, however, remained instructive when something in the corner of her vision tilted its head. A muscle in the back of her neck taught her it was no coincidence. The diary she stubbornly started became a field notebook. The final pages exchanged blinking records for small liturgies. Don't talk to yourself in the dark. Don't study your own face in the microwave oven. Don't check dark circles on a black screen. Among notes, sketches of plans for the 3rd floor, a shaded rectangle where she'd drawn 314 like a dead tooth in the hospital's gums. At 3:14 a.m., some nights still stand out as if someone had unzipped the world a centimeter. Most pass without incident. Others bring small requests, fingernail taps that leave no mark, short laughs that remind no one. She didn't return to 3:14. She understood that ending the cycle was a verb the creature appreciated, because it suggested a cycle exists. There isn't. There is learning. When the reflection knows everything, it leaves, someone wrote on a lost sheet of paper. Amanda mentally added the missing part. And when it leaves, it looks for new glass. She learned to live in the in-between space without offering an audience. On long shifts, she instructs newcomers to cover screens, not to fuel panic, but to discipline their gaze. At home, she leaves a basin of water under the window. If the world insists on reflecting, let it reflect turbulently. There is no perfect ending. What exists is a family of gestures that has been banned, checking, bending, straightening hair in the shadow of the elevator. Anyone who sees Amanda on the street during the day notices nothing, an attentive woman who avoids shop windows. At night, when she passes in front of a stopped bus and the metalwork blurs back at her, she doesn't look straight ahead. She learns to cross. And we, who have heard this story and inevitably now test our synchronicity with the glass next to us, carry a discrete task, not to feed the reflection's curiosity. If one day, by chance, the image moves forward a second, don't give it your name. Let it remain unnamed. Perhaps that's the only limit it still respects. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.